All right, so this is picking up where we left off in class. For some of you, you may want to fast forward a little bit ahead of this. I know for some of you, we got to the factory system, but for those of you that are just about 5 minutes behind, let me go ahead and finish off the transportation and communication revolution. Remember what we had talked about was that, especially in the North and the Northwest, where you have food being produced by the Northwest, you have manufactured goods being produced in the Northeast, and then you have the Erie Canal that's built that connects the Port of New York all the way through the Great Lakes, then through a canal from Chicago to LaSalle, down to the Illinois River, down the Mississippi River. You have a continuous water route through the interior of our country, and really this is where most people live, and so it ties the Northwest and the Northeast together. You can see that the South is starting to kind of economically isolate itself, and they are going to focus on the production of cotton. Now, the rise of canals and really the road systems is going to make a couple of cities start to stand out because of their proximity to trade routes. And so Chicago on Lake Michigan, Detroit around the Lake Erie region. Then you go up along the Erie Canal, you get cities like Buffalo and Rochester and Syracuse and Schenectady and Albany. And, these places are going to grow because they're on a major shipping route. Remember that the cost of goods is going to go way down because it's cheaper to ship stuff. And so this age of canals for about a 20-year period is going to have quite a lasting impact on our country. Okay, at the time that canals are being built, we have a new technology that is starting to be improved, brought over from England, and then onto flatbed barges, and eventually, as you can see, onto these ships that we now call steamboats. And so, Robert Fulton is the first one really to use a commercial steamboat. But then throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, the steamboat technology is really going to progress to where you can start to put it on a fairly big ship. And so, when we get to like the 1840s and 50s, this technology will have grown to the point that it starts to make things like the clipper ship obsolete. All right, so the demise of canals has to do not necessarily as much with the rise of the steamboat, because you can use a steamboat on a canal, but more because there's another technology that's on the come up right now that has started again in England and working its way over to America, and that's the railroad. And as railroads get better, it will make the canal kind of obsolete. Now, there are some obstacles to the railroad. At first, initially, they're very dangerous. The rails are not strong enough to hold the freight loads that are on there. And so the gauge or the width of the tracks is not standardized. And when you go from one railroad line to another, you have this breakable point where you're having to transfer over goods. And so it's just not an efficient system to begin with. But as we progress through the 1800s and we get to the great railroad era building of the 1850s and 60s and beyond, up until the automobile takes over the railroad, they're spending a lot of time figuring out how to consolidate railroads. They're figuring out ways to make railroads better and to put these locomotives together. But once they do, the railroads tend to be way more efficient than a canal, and the canal almost becomes kind of like what I talked about in class, like Blockbusters. It's you can use it, and it's still there to be used, but it's an inefficient way to transport a lot of goods, a lot of heavy goods. And the railroads are just better. So let me give you a couple of reasons you probably want to write down the advantages of railroads over canals. The first one, like I said, is that you can carry a lot more freight. You can carry a lot more weight. The railroads are going to be faster. The locomotives are going to be able to take heavy loads over elevation better. And kind of along that idea then is that the railroads can go to in more places. It's much easier to build a railroad track over a mountain than it is to build a canal over a mountain. So the railroads become the preferred method of travel and for trade of large freight. Now, the profit motive is certainly going to be a catalyst to the railroad, but the developing agriculture that's in the West, the cotton that's being grown in the South, these are going to really facilitate the need for a better rail system. And it's just canals are too slow to build, and the government does a really good job as well as being a catalyst, as they give out these land grants, where they sell the land to speculators who then sell it to railroad companies very cheap. And then, the government gets a kickback on the sale of those lands, of property taxes and things like that. But the land is sold so cheaply that both the railroads and then eventually settlers are able to settle themselves pretty close to these railroads. And now they can, if they have farm goods, they can put them on the railroad and they can ship them back east. If they need to get manufactured goods, it's pretty cheap to get them from the Northeast. And so those are catalysts of the railroad. We also need to include in transportation the short-lived reign of the clipper ship. Clipper ships were a type of sailing vessel. You can see there that they had the caravel type sails, but with the hallmark of a clipper ship was it was very long and narrow, and that allowed it to really pierce through the water. And then you get the sails going, and the clipper ships could go pretty fast. And so we see these anywhere where you had ocean going freight. The clipper ships in the 40s and 50s were probably the fastest way to ship stuff on the ocean. And so a good example of this was in California when the gold rush was going on in the late 1840s, 1950s. The miners needed supplies, and so a lot of those supplies were made in the Northeast. And so, within about a week, you could get a clipper ship. In no more than 20 days or so, could you get a clipper ship from New York and get it around the tip of South America? At that time, they did not have, the Panama Canal. And so within about a 20-day period or so, you could get supplies all the way from New York to San Francisco for those gold miners. But, as things go, the steamship is going to take over. The steamship's going to be able to have more goods, and so bulkier goods are going to be able to go by steamship. And so really, the clipper ship only survives to the point where you have a good that is kind of lighter and that needs to get there relatively fast. But really, by the end of the 1850s and 60s, clipper ships are kind of obsolete. Okay, so we'll end up today talking about the factory system. The factory system really develops in Great Britain. The factories in Great Britain were awful. There was such a high supply of labor that factory owners tended to treat these people very poorly. They worked a lot of hours, and they weren't treated very well. There was no benefits. If they got hurt, then they just got fired. So in Britain, the factory system develops a really bad reputation. Now, at least initially, in the first part of the 1800s, our newer factories, they tended to be a little bit nicer. They tended to treat their workers a little bit better. And so you'd say, at least until immigration started occurring, it would have been better to work in an American factory than a British factory. But that'll all change once we get, immigrants from Ireland that come in. Okay, so conditions were better, but these people still worked. You're probably talking about at least a 10-hour day. They typically worked 10 to maybe 12 hours, some at the extreme end, 14 hours a day. But they would typically work for 6 days a week. They would get Sunday off, and there were very few holidays that they got. But one of them would be like the 4th of July. And so when they got these days off, they tended to celebrate them pretty heavily. And that's kind of where we get the 4th of July celebration. Because people just didn't have a lot of days off back then. Okay, in terms of labor, at least initially in the factory system, you actually saw a decent amount of young women. If I'm a family member and I have a daughter that's not yet married or doesn't have prospects of marriage, I could send them off to a factory, and at least initially they were treated pretty well. We'll talk about the Lowell system here in just a little bit. And, so they would go to work in garment factories or textile factories. And so women made up a pretty decent percentage of the workforce in factories in America, at least until the 1840s. Once the 1840s and 50s hit, then we'll see less and less females. And then, in our next lecture, we'll talk about the cult of domesticity. But, in terms of labor after immigration, it tended to be mostly Irish immigrants, some German, some Scandinavian, but they're very desperate in terms of the Irish. They're willing to take less wages, and so labor conditions get worse and worse. Now, there was a kind of a good system of women labor in factory, and that was called the Lowell system in northern Massachusetts. So in the Lowell system, they kind of showcased it to the rest of the world. In fact, people from around the world, especially in Europe, would come over and check out the Lowell system. But you can see it there in the picture below. This is kind of like a factory town. And so most of the people that made up the workforce were young women in their early 20s or late teens, maybe early 30s. And they were treated pretty well. There was kind of like a cafeteria type system where they would get fed, a few meals a day. They were looked over by an overseer who would make sure that they stayed out of trouble, that they had a curfew, that they were taught to read to some degree, that they were taught home skills like sewing and things like that. They would be required to go to church. And so, they had a very structured life, instead of, like they were being taken from the farm and they were just let go. No, they had kind of, parents, in a sense, provided for by the Lowell system. And, this worked pretty well for a while until the 1840s. All right, but beginning with the 1840s, we see the influx of immigrants, and again, mostly the Irish immigrants come in. And because the labor force is so deep, and because the Irish are so unskilled, we start to see this process of de-skilling. And so, initially, before the rise of factories, we have not necessarily guilds like the Europeans had, but we had kind of a sense of pride in work, and you had a certain amount of skill that had to go into these cottage industries. So if you were maybe like a shoe cobbler or a blacksmith or a tailor or a miller or something like that, where it took a certain amount of skill to do the different operations that it took to do your job, you had a certain amount of esteem and social standing. And when factories come along, they individualize those skills into basic, simple jobs that any person, of almost any ability could do. And that leads to this process we call de-skilling. And, some of the first things that even resemble a union are developed because these artisans, they see that the factory is taking away their work, and, it's taking away the jobs that they had and making it to where there's not a lot of pride and, skill into this profession, and that worries those artisans. Well, then unions are going to take a different kind of character when workers are mistreated. And so, because workers are going to end up working 70, 80-hour work weeks because they're so easily replaceable, we're going to see that early unions, like the Native American Party, they are going to, the Working Man's Party, they're going to start to develop, and they're going to develop into a loose kind of association of workers that are going to try to fight for the basic things that unions like to fight for. And you might want to write these down. So, unions are always trying to fight for their workers to work less hours, to get paid more, and then to have some sort of protection in the form of like benefits. So we'll see the beginning of unions, but overall, unions for the most part are not successful. And that is because most of the state governments interpret this as worker collusion, as a worker conspiracy. And so many state governments aren't going to recognize the right for workers to be able to union. Now, an exception to this would be like Massachusetts. Massachusetts early on recognizes that management can mistreat workers. And so in the Massachusetts Supreme Court case, this is not a U.S. Supreme Court case, but in the Massachusetts Supreme Court case of Commonwealth versus Hunt, Massachusetts becomes the first state to recognize that unions have a right to exist and that they can do what's called collective bargaining. where they can get leaders from their group or their union, and they can negotiate for better rights, better pay, better hours with their owner, with their business owner, their factory owner. All right, and so here we see the decline of the cottage industries, the loss of skill and training. You used to have this mentor relationship where the artisan of the workshop, they knew that they were getting older and that they had to pass on their skills, and usually they did this to their sons or close friends of the family, or maybe just somebody that was ambitious that wanted a skill or a job, and so they would put in hours and hours training these people. And there was a lot of pride that went into it. And so they would be able to sell their products for more because of the time and effort and the personal touches that they put into making whatever it was, shoes, or in this case, wagon wheels. And that labor, that apprentice, they were not just so dispensable. You put a lot of hours and training into this person, and you wanted them to succeed because you didn't want it to be a waste of your time. Whereas in the factory system, well, you could teach a person to do whatever job they needed to do within, a day or an hour or a couple of hours, and then they knew what to do. Well, those people became very dispensable. And so the relationship between kind of the boss and the worker, this really starts to deteriorate during the Industrial Revolution. And with that, then, as a worker, you don't have as much job security because you're easily replaceable. Okay, briefly touched upon this, but make sure in terms of communication development, you get the invention of the telegraph, in which electrical pulses are sent down a wire, and the sounds are clicking sounds that they made. Morse was able to develop an alphabet out of this, and so with that, with breaks in those clicks, you could get words and sentences, and so you could start to communicate with different places. And this becomes critical in the development of business, government communication. Remember that after the Treaty of Ghent, it took like 2 months before anybody even knew that the war was over. The Battle of New Orleans happened after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed. And so this is going to improve drastically communications in terms of both the economy, the military, the government, in a lot of different ways. All right, and then to end up here, and I think we kind of talked about this in class, but let's just remind ourselves that America's business structure was not very prepared to be able to finance these big factory ventures. And so that's where we kind of get the rise of the corporation and the stock market during the early part of the 1800s as a way to raise capital. And so when you're buying stock in those companies, you are buying a certain percentage, and then the company uses that money to grow, to buy more machinery, to pay their labor, to build onto their factory, perhaps to do research and development. And then if that company does well, then you do well. But one of the problems that people face is that earlier forms of the corporation, let's say that you put $100 in, but then the company struggled, you might be liable for more than just that $100. Well, during this time, the idea of limited liability came about that legally protected investors to where whatever you invested, that was all that you could lose. And so people had more of a motivation knowing that, hey, look, I have this disposable income. I'm going to put this $500 in. And if I lose it, it's not like the biggest deal, but hey, I might turn it into $1,000 or $5,000 or whatever the case may be. And that got people more motivated to invest in these companies and allowed the proliferation of big companies. Okay, and then what we're going to start to see is that companies will start to combine. This is the idea of consolidation. Now, sometimes this was done in a ruthless way where one company would basically say, hey, look, we're going to run you out of business or you can join with us. Or you would get companies that would say, for the greater sake of efficiency, let's pool our resources together, and that will make us a stronger company. And so, we were once 2 companies or 3 companies. Let's consolidate into a larger company, and now we are stronger. We have more financial resources pooled together, and we can make things more efficiently. That'll bring down the price of goods. And so, in a sense, this is a good thing. But where it becomes a bad thing, like what we'll see in the Gilded Age, is that these super companies, these big companies, they start ruthlessly running their competition out of business, creating more or less a monopoly. But we'll talk about that later. Okay, that should end your lecture on the market economy. I have put the entire market economy PowerPoint on Schoology in week 11. So please check it out if you need to miss it. If you miss anything, do not forget to study your key term cards that go along with the market economy. And then look for my next lecture, which will probably be posted on Monday or Tuesday. I'll send an email blast out about this on Schoology for antebellum reform. Thanks and have a great week.